October 7th, 1571. A morning of unnerving stillness in the Gulf of Patras. Two titanic fleets, the Ottoman crescent and the Holy League's desperate line, prepared for a clash that would redefine an empire and a world. This wasn't just a battle, it was the end of a 100-year march, the shattering of an unshakable myth, and a spark of human resilience. The sheer scale of the forces at play, over 200 Ottoman galleys, bristling with seasoned warriors, met the Holy League's 212, anchored by Venice's innovative, heavily armed galleasses, floating fortresses that unleashed a thunderous prelude to the main engagement. The improbable courage. Don John of Austria, a young, unacknowledged prince, led a desperate alliance of old enemies, bound by fear and a shared enemy. He danced on his ship's prow at dawn, not with nerves, but with a resolve that ignited his men. The human cost and its unexpected ripple. 12,000 Christian slaves were freed from Ottoman galleys, a brutal testament to the stakes. And a wounded soldier, Miguel de Cervantes, would go on to pen a timeless novel, forever changed by this day. The Battle of Lepanto didn't just change maps, it changed narratives. It proved even the most formidable empires can falter. Want to dive deeper into the turning points of history? Subscribe to my channel Military Strategy Stories for more gripping stories of courage, conflict, and consequence. The morning of October 7th, 1571, arrived without wind. In the Gulf of Patras, silence came first. That absence of wind matters more than almost anything else that happened that day. The Gulf of Patras, that narrow blue corridor between the Greek mainland and the Peloponnese, lay flat and silver in the early light, unnaturally still, as if the sea itself were holding its breath before something it did not want to witness. The sun had not yet cleared the mountains to the east. In the gray pre-dawn haze, the surface of the water reflected nothing but sky. And then, slowly, they appeared. To the east, the Ottoman fleet materialized out of the morning like a vision from a nightmare. 278 galleys and galleots arranged in a vast crescent stretching nearly 3 miles across the Gulf, oars rising and dipping in unison, each stroke pulling that crescent tighter, closer, hungrier. Their hulls were painted in blood red and gold. Their banners, green silk stitched with gold Quranic verses, snapped in the almost nothing of a breeze. At the center of that crescent flew the great silken standard of Ali Pasha, admiral of the Ottoman fleet, a man who had never lost a battle on water, and who had been told by his sultan that he would not lose this one either. 300 years of Ottoman expansion had brought this fleet to this morning. 3 centuries of conquest, of crushed kingdoms and burning cities, and Christian slaves chained to rowing benches, had built the empire that now advanced across this still water. And the men inside those hulls, the janissaries with their recurve bows, the sipahis in their layered armor, the skilled corsair captains who had raided the coasts of Spain and Italy and Greece as casually as merchants visit markets, believed with the absolute certainty of men who have never been beaten that today would end the same way every other day had ended, in victory. To the west, the Holy League answered them. 212 galleys and 6 massive galleasses moved forward in a long, straight line. And if the Ottoman crescent was beautiful in the terrible way that predators are beautiful, then the Holy League's formation was something rawer and more desperate, a wall of men and wood and iron that had no room to be elegant, because it was fighting for its survival. Flying above that line were the banners of Spain and Venice and the Papal States and the Knights of Malta and Genoa and Savoy, ancient enemies who had spent the previous decade trying to ruin one another, who had argued and screamed and nearly walked away from this alliance a dozen times, bound together now by something stronger than friendship, which is fear. And at the center of the Christian line, standing on the prow of the flagship Real, as if the battle had not yet begun and he were simply watching the sunrise, was a young man of 24 named Don John of Austria, illegitimate son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, half-brother of King Philip II of Spain, and the most improbable admiral in the history of the Mediterranean. He would not be watching sunrises much longer. This battle, fought on a Sunday morning in a narrow Grecian gulf between fleets that together held more than 100,000 men, did not simply decide who controlled the Mediterranean. It ended the Ottoman Empire's 100-year march toward the Atlantic. It shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility at sea. It freed 12,000 Christian men from the oars of enemy galleys. And it produced, almost as an afterthought, a wound in the left hand of a 24-year-old Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes that would, decades later, contribute to the creation of the most important novel in the history of Western literature. This single morning changed the world forever. To understand what happened at Lepanto, you must first understand a man named Marcantonio Bragadin and what was done to him. In the summer of 1570, the Ottoman Empire invaded the island of Cyprus. Cyprus was a Venetian possession, a prosperous island of vineyards and salt flats and trading ports that had been Venice's most valuable eastern holding for nearly a century. The Ottomans had coveted it for decades. When Sultan Selim II, a man his own historians called the Sot for his love of wine, which is perhaps the most spectacular irony in Ottoman history, decided to take Cyprus, he sent an army of 80,000 men and a fleet that dwarfed anything Venice could field alone. The Venetians fought bravely. They held the city of Famagusta for almost a year, an extraordinary defense against overwhelming odds. And when the city finally fell in August 1571, the Venetian commander, Marcantonio Bragadin, negotiated an honorable surrender. The Ottoman general, Lala Mustafa Pasha, agreed to all its terms. He gave his word. He shook Bragadin's hand. And then he tortured him for 11 days. Bragadin's ears and nose were cut off. He was paraded through the streets of Famagusta on a donkey. He was hoisted up the mast of a galley in a cage, displayed to the fleet. He was dragged to the main square, chained to a column, and flayed alive. His skin peeled from his body while he was still breathing, while he recited psalms, while the crowd watched. When he died, his skin was stuffed with straw, dressed in his armor, and sent to Constantinople as a trophy. It was displayed there for years. When news of what had been done to Bragadin reached Venice, it produced something very specific and very dangerous. Not grief, not despair, not the numb resignation of a city that has lost a war. It produced rage. And rage, channeled correctly, can move mountains. It moved something harder than mountains. It moved the Venetians, who had a proverb that went roughly, "We will make peace with the devil himself if it profits us." The Venetians made peace with Spain. This was not simple. Venice and Spain despised each other with the particular intensity of commercial rivals who have been stealing each other's business for generations. Spain and Venice had entirely different ideas about how the Mediterranean should be organized, about who should control which ports, about where trade should flow and who should tax it. They had different interests in the same waters, and it spent 40 years making sure the other could not dominate those waters. But Bragadin's skin, stuffed with straw and hanging in a Constantinople warehouse, had a way of clarifying things. So did Pope Pius V, a gaunt Dominican friar who had been elected pope 5 years earlier on a platform of moral reform and who had since become obsessed with organizing a crusade against the Ottomans. Pius V was not a diplomat. He was a mystic and a fanatic, but a fanatic with considerable political skill and the ability to make Philip II of Spain feel genuinely guilty, which is a rare and powerful talent. The Pope wept when he prayed. He fasted until he fainted. He wrote letters to every Catholic monarch in Europe, begging for ships and men and money. Most of them ignored him. Spain and Venice did not. On May 25, 1571, the Holy League was formally signed in Rome. Spain would provide the largest share of the fleet and the supreme commander. Venice would provide the galleys and the knowledge of eastern Mediterranean waters. The Pope would provide money, prayers, and what he believed was the active intervention of the Virgin Mary. The terms were contentious and uncomfortable for everyone involved, but they held. Because behind every negotiation, behind every concession and counter-demand, there was Bragadine's stuffed skin. And nobody who knew about it wanted to be on the side that had done that. The man chosen to command the Holy League fleet was, by every conventional measure, an unlikely choice. Don John of Austria. Born Juan de Austria in Regensburg in 1547, the illegitimate son of Emperor Charles V and a German noblewoman named Barbara Blomberg, had spent his childhood in obscurity, raised by a Spanish family who did not know who his father was. He was not acknowledged as a royal until he was 13 years old, not given the title Don John until he was older still. He was, in the bluntest terms, a bastard who had been elevated to nobility by the posthumous generosity of his father's will, and who had spent his entire adolescence being defined by what he was not the king, not the legitimate heir, not the man who would inherit anything. That particular wound, of being the almost son, the almost prince, the brilliant boy who would always stand one step to the side of the throne, had created in Don John a hunger for glory that no amount of battle could entirely satisfy. He was, at 24, already a war hero. He had crushed the Morisco rebellion in Granada with a savagery that troubled even his supporters. He could dance and joust and compose music. He wore the finest clothes in Spain, kept company with the finest minds, and wrote letters to his brother the king that alternated between flattery and barely concealed resentment. He was handsome in the way that makes artists reach for their brushes. And he was, above everything else, someone who wanted this battle more than he had ever wanted anything. His brother had given him the fleet. He intended to use it. On the other side of the water, Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha commanded the Ottoman fleet with a confidence that was not arrogance, because it was not unfounded. He was a capable admiral, a man who had risen through the ranks of Ottoman naval service through ability rather than birth, and who had the advantage of commanding the most powerful naval force in the Mediterranean. He had 270 warships, crews hardened by years of raiding and battle, janissaries who had never been defeated on any kind of field, and the institutional weight of the most successful military empire of the past 3 centuries behind him. His sultan had told him, "If you win, you shall be worthy of your command. If you lose, come back victorious, or do not come back at all." Ali Pasha had heard similar things before. He had always come back victorious. He did not know about the galleasses. The Gulf of Patras is not a dramatic landscape. It does not have the towering cliffs of some Greek passages, or the labyrinthine channels that favor certain kinds of naval ambush. It is, in most ways, an ordinary Mediterranean Gulf, roughly 40 kilometers wide at its mouth, narrowing as it extends eastward, its waters changing from deep navy blue to a lighter turquoise as the bottom rises toward the shore. The mountains of Aetolia and Acarnania rim its northern shore. The Peloponnese closes it to the south. At its eastern end, where the gulf narrows most sharply, sits the town of Patras. And it was in the broader western portion of this gulf, just off the headland of Scrofa on the Greek mainland, that the two fleets found each other on the morning of October 7th, 1571. The geography shaped everything about how the battle would have to be fought. There was no room here for the Ottoman crescent's traditional tactic of extreme flanking, of sending fast galleys racing far around the edges of an enemy formation to envelop it from the rear. The gulf was wide enough for the crescent to deploy, but not wide enough for it to close its arms completely around a line formation, without those arms running into the shores. This was not an accident. Don John had studied maps of this region for weeks. He had consulted with Venetian admirals who had sailed these waters for 40 years. He knew that the geography would limit Ali Pasha's options, and he had chosen this as his preferred area of engagement. But geography alone does not win battles. Ships and men and weapons do. The Holy League fleet was organized into 4 divisions. The center, under Don John himself on the Real, held 62 galleys. The left wing, under Agostino Barbarigo of Venice, covered the northern shore with 53 galleys. The right wing, under Giovanni Andrea Doria of Genoa, held another 53 galleys on the southern side. And behind the main line, a reserve squadron of 30 galleys under the Marquis of Santa Cruz waited to reinforce wherever the line broke first. But the most important element of the Holy League formation was positioned not within the line, but in front of it: the galleasses. Venice had built 6 of them in a remarkable burst of engineering ingenuity in the months before Lepanto. A galleass was something that had not quite existed before in that form, a hybrid creature that combined the rowing power of a galley with the firepower of a sailing warship, a vessel so heavy that it could not be rowed quickly and was towed to position by smaller galleys, but which, once positioned, became something the Mediterranean had never faced. Each galleass carried 30 to 40 heavy cannon, not just on the sides as galleys carried their guns, but forward, aft, and all along the length of the ship. A standard Ottoman galley carried 3 or 4 guns, all pointing forward, which meant it could only fire directly at what it was attacking. A galleass could fire in almost any direction simultaneously. It was, in essence, a floating fortress, and Venice had placed 2 in front of each division of the Holy League fleet, towed into position before the battle began, with instructions that were brutally simple: don't move, and shoot everything. The Ottoman fleet was organized along more traditional lines. Ali Pasha's crescent formation was the standard Ottoman deployment, refined over decades of successful combat. The right wing, nearly 280 galleys and lighter galleots total, stretched almost 3 miles across the Gulf. The center, under Ali Pasha himself on the Sultana, held 87 galleys. The right wing, facing the Holy League's left, was commanded by Mehmed Sirocco, who had local knowledge of the waters off Patras. The left wing, facing Doria, was commanded by Ulugh Ali, a Calabrian-born former Christian slave who had converted to Islam, risen through piracy and naval service to become one of the most dangerous sea commanders in the Mediterranean, and who was the one Ottoman admiral who fully understood what the Holy League was capable of. On the eve of battle, Ulugh Ali had reportedly told Ali Pasha that he was concerned, that the Christian fleet was stronger than it appeared, that the galleasses, in particular, were something to be taken seriously. Ali Pasha had disagreed. The Ottoman fleet outnumbered the Christians. It had always been enough before. Inside the hulls of both fleets, the night before battle had passed in very different ways. Don John slept for 3 hours, rose before the other officers, and spent an hour in prayer in the small chapel of the Real. Then he dressed with unusual care, putting on a suit of gilded armor that he had been saving for an occasion that deserved it. He was seen by multiple witnesses dancing on the prow of his flagship in the pre-dawn darkness. Not the frantic movement of a man trying to calm his nerves, but something more deliberate, more theatrical, almost liturgical, as if he were performing the last ritual of a man about to give himself entirely to something larger than himself. He visited every ship in the center division before the fleet formed up, being rowed from galley to galley in a small boat, standing in the bow, calling out to the men on the benches and the soldiers at the railings. He promised them glory. He promised them God's favor. He promised them that if they fought well, they would be remembered. He did not promise them that they would survive. He was smart enough, or honest enough, not to do that. In the Ottoman fleet, Ali Pasha prepared in his own way. He had, the previous day, received intelligence that the Holy League fleet was approaching, and had called a council of his senior commanders. Ulugh Ali had pressed again for caution, for retreat to a more favorable anchorage, for a defensive posture that would neutralize the Christian advantage in firepower. Mehmed Sirocco had agreed with him. Ali Pasha had overruled them both. He had his orders from the Sultan. He had his confidence in the size of his fleet and the quality of his soldiers. And he had something else, a green flag, the sacred banner of the prophet, which he had been entrusted to carry, and which he believed, genuinely, with the faith of a man who had spent his life in service to his God, would protect him. The banner was hung from the mainmast of the Sultana that night, and the men of the fleet could see it glowing in the torchlight, all 278 ships sharing the sight of it, drawing whatever courage a flag can give a man the night before he might die. In the rowing benches of the Ottoman galleys, the Christian slaves who had been chained there for months or years listened to the sounds of preparation and understood nothing about what was coming, except that tomorrow something different was going to happen. They could feel it in the way the guards moved, in the pitch of the voices, in the urgency that had replaced the usual grinding routine of captivity. They did not know whether different would be better or worse. They chained to the oars and prayed in languages their captors did not speak: Italian, Spanish, Greek, Portuguese, the desperate polyglot of men who have been reduced to their most essential selves. Don John had been told about those men, about how many of them there were, about what their lives in Ottoman galleys were like. He had seen some of them, freed from captured ships in previous years, and had listened to what they said. On the morning of October 7th, rowing out to give his final speech before the fleet formed up, he thought about them. He knew that if the battle went wrong, more men would join them in those chains. He knew that if it went right, those particular men would see the sun set as free men.
That knowledge had a weight to it that was different from the weight of empire and religion and politics. It was simpler, it was human, and it made him angrier in the best possible way. The soldiers on the Holy League galleys had passed the night in ways that varied by nationality and temperament, but shared an undertow of the same quiet reckoning. The Spanish veterans, men who had fought in Italy and the Low Countries and Granada, cleaned their weapons with the methodical calm of professionals who have done this before enough times to make it a ritual rather than a preparation. The Venetian sailors, whose republic had been fighting for its commercial survival for a decade, talked in low voices about Cyprus and about Bragadine, and about what it meant to have a friend or a cousin who had been taken in the raids along the Adriatic shore. The priests who had been assigned to every galley in the fleet moved through the darkness from sailor to sailor and soldier to soldier, hearing confessions, distributing absolution with the efficiency of men who understood that they were in the business of processing large numbers quickly. Several soldiers received their last rites. They accepted them with a calm that was partly faith and partly fatalism, and partly the particular dignity of men who have decided that they will not be afraid of a thing they cannot avoid. One Genoese crossbowman, whose name appears only in the register of his galley's crew as G. Palermo, reportedly played a 3-stringed instrument throughout the late hours, sitting on the deck above the rowing bench in the dark, playing the same song over and over until one of the soldiers near him asked him to stop, and he put the instrument away and sat quietly until morning. Whether he survived the battle, the register does not say. Dawn had barely cleared the mountains when the Ottoman fleet first came into full view of the Holy League. It was approximately 6 in the morning. The galleasses had been towed into position over the previous 2 hours, their heavy hulls dragged forward by straining smaller galleys until each was positioned roughly 500 meters ahead of the main Christian line. Don John had formed his fleet in the long, straight line he had planned, his galleys bow to bow across the Gulf, the reserve squadron holding 300 meters behind the center. The wind, which had been from the west earlier in the morning and would have favored the Ottomans, had shifted. It now came lightly from the east, behind the Christian fleet. It was, in the eyes of many present on the Christian side, a sign from God. In the eyes of many on the Ottoman side, who noticed the shift with a quiet unease, it was merely weather. Ali Pasha had ordered his crescent forward. The Ottoman formation moved at the stroke of something like 200 pairs of oars, a single mechanical heartbeat repeated 200 times over, the sound of it carrying across the still water like the pulse of some enormous organism that had mistaken the Gulf for its habitat. The green silken banner at the Sultana's mast caught the morning light and turned it gold.
On the northern shore, a cluster of fishing boats whose crews had been smart enough not to venture out that morning sat quietly beached, their occupants watching from the hills above, understanding that what they were seeing would not come again in their lifetimes. They were right. The first phase of the battle was not fought by galleys at all. It was fought by the galleasses. As the Ottoman crescent drove forward across the water, its outstretched arms reaching toward the flanks of the Christian line, the Ottoman front ranks encountered the 6 floating fortresses that had been positioned in their path. No one in the Ottoman fleet had faced galleasses before. They had heard of them, perhaps, as a rumor, a new Venetian weapon, something large and heavily gunned, but the scale of what they were about to experience had not been communicated clearly, because the men who might have communicated it clearly had not survived the encounters they would have needed to have. The Ottoman galleys slowed as they approached, the commanders uncertain, their oarsmen still pulling but with the hesitation of men whose instincts are telling them something their training has not prepared them for. Then the galleasses opened fire. The sound was not like anything that had been heard on those waters before, or anywhere in the Mediterranean in living memory. 30 guns firing simultaneously from a single platform, not a broadside in the later naval sense, but a coordinated, directional volley aimed directly at the approaching Ottoman front ranks, produced a concussive wave of noise that witnesses on both sides would describe for the rest of their lives as the voice of God, or the voice of something they had no better word for. The Ottoman front galleys took the broadside at a range of less than 300 meters. Several were struck at or near the waterline. One capsized almost immediately, rolling onto its side with shocking speed, the sound of its oars snapping like a forest of bones. Others took hits amidships, their decks shattered, their janissary soldiers thrown into the water or pinned beneath collapsed rigging. The Ottoman line faltered. It did not stop. Ali Pasha, watching from the Sultana, ordered it forward again, and forward again it went. But it faltered, and in that faltering something had already begun to change. The galleasses fired a second time, and a third. By the time the Ottoman front ranks had passed the galleasses and the main battle was joined, an estimated 8 Ottoman galleys had been sunk or disabled, and perhaps 3,000 men killed or wounded, before a single boarding action had taken place. That was the galleasses' first and greatest contribution. Not the ships they destroyed, though they destroyed several, but the disorder they created. The Ottoman crescent reached the Christian line at an angle that was no longer quite right. Its flanks were not where Ali Pasha had intended them to be, and the Christian galleys, which had sat at their oars watching the galleasses work, were fresh and still and ready, while the Ottomans had been rowing for an hour and a half and had just absorbed the psychological shock of something entirely new. But the galleasses were over now. The main battle had arrived. By 9 in the morning, the full length of both lines had made contact, and what followed can only be described inadequately by any sequence of words, because it happened on a 3-mile front simultaneously, 400 individual engagements occurring at once, each one a world of chaos and fire and close-quarters killing that left no space for the kind of grand narrative view that history requires. The sound was continuous and enormous. Cannon fire, arquebuses, the grinding crash of galley rams and oars, men screaming in a dozen languages, and the smoke from hundreds of guns mixing with the smell of salt and blood and burning wood created an atmosphere of sensory overload so complete that men who survived it would later say they had fought the entire battle in a kind of waking dream. On the left wing, things went badly first. Agostino Barbarigo's division faced Mehmed Sirocco, who had exact knowledge of the shallow waters along the northern shore and immediately exploited it. Ottoman galleys curved sharply northward, using the shallows as a wall that prevented Barbarigo from extending his line in that direction, and then drove into the Venetian flank with a fury that staggered even experienced sailors. Barbarigo had positioned himself at the extreme northern end of his line to guard exactly this approach,
and when the Ottoman galleys struck his position, he was in the thick of it immediately. An arrow found a gap in his visor and drove into his eye. He was carried below decks, still alive, still giving orders through the blood. His subordinates held the line in his name, fighting with a desperation that was partly grief and partly the particular courage that Venice's sailors had always had. Men who lived by the sea and knew what the sea could give and take. Men for whom the alternative to victory was not just death, but the ore bench, slavery, the Mediterranean as a prison. The Venetians held, but barely. And for the first hour, Barbarigo's left wing was the closest thing to collapsing that the Holy League line came. On the right wing, something more complicated was happening. Giovanni Andrea Doria was a careful man. He had spent his career being careful, and he had survived longer than most of his contemporaries by virtue of that carefulness. He was also, and this is important, fighting on the same wing as Ulik Ali, who was not careful at all, but was brilliant and unpredictable, and had spent decades learning to exploit exactly the kind of opponent that Doria was. When Doria's galleys began to slide southward, moving away from the main line, extending his right wing to prevent Ulik Ali from enveloping it, he created a gap. It was not a large gap. It was perhaps 200 meters of open water between his wing and Don John's center. But 200 meters of open water in a naval battle is not a small thing. It is a corridor, and Ulik Ali saw it. 15 Ottoman galleys drove through the gap like a fist through a curtain. They went straight for the Knights of Malta, who were positioned at the junction between the center and the right wing, and who were arguably the finest hand-to-hand fighters in the entire Holy League fleet. The next 20 minutes on that section of the line were among the most violent of the entire battle. The Knights of Malta, outnumbered and partially enveloped, fought with the concentrated ferocity of men who have been fighting Muslims in the name of their faith for their entire adult lives, and for whom defeat is theologically unacceptable. They lost their flagship. They lost their captain. They lost a third of their men. But they did not break, and the reserve squadron under the Marquis of Santa Cruz, already driving to plug the gap, reached the position just as the last of the knights were going under. Santa Cruz hit Uluch Ali from the side with 30 fresh galleys, and the momentum shifted. Uluch Ali, suddenly facing 2 directions of attack, made the decision that would define his place in history. He cut the one Maltese banner he had managed to capture from the rigging of his flagship, turned his remaining galleys, and ran. He was the only Ottoman commander to escape the battle with any ships at all. He would live to fight many more battles, but he would carry the memory of this one with him. At the center, everything came down to 2 ships. The Real and the Sultana had been driving toward each other since the battle began, as if the 2 flagships understood that their encounter was the axis on which everything else would turn. By 10 in the morning, they had come within range of each other's heavy guns, and the exchange that followed was enormous. Cannon fire at close range, the screams of men and the crack of timber, smoke so thick that the marksmen on the upper decks of both ships were firing at shapes rather than men. Don John was everywhere on the Real, sword drawn, moving through the smoke from position to position, rallying soldiers who did not need rallying because they were already fighting with everything they had. He was hit by a musket ball that struck his foot and drew blood. He ignored it. He had been waiting for this day his entire life, and a wound in the foot was not going to take it from him. The 2 flagships rammed each other twice before they finally locked together. When the boarding planks came down between the Real and the Sultana, the fighting that followed was some of the most intense of the entire engagement. Don John's soldiers, Spanish veterans of the Italian wars, arquebusiers and swordsmen, who had spent their professional lives killing at close range, poured across the boarding planks into the Sultana under continuous fire. They were met by janissaries who did the same thing, who had spent their professional lives killing at close range, who had the sacred banner of the Prophet above them and the certainty of paradise ahead. 3 times the Spanish took the Sultana's forward deck. 3 times the janissaries drove them back. The planks were slick with blood. Men fell into the water between the ships and were ground between the hulls. The noise was unbearable.
It was not a battle anymore. It was a slaughterhouse that happened to be floating. The fourth assault did not come back. Ali Pasha was on the Sultana's deck, fighting personally, when a Spanish arquebus shot found him. Some accounts say he was struck in the head. Others say the chest. He fell. For a moment, the janissaries around him did not understand what had happened, and in that moment, the Spanish surged forward again and did not stop this time. Ali Pasha was found alive, barely, on the deck of his own ship. A Spanish soldier, whose name history did not preserve, cut off his head. The head was placed on a pike. It was raised above the fighting and carried to the prow of the Real and held up, visible, for the entire fleet to see. The green banner of the Prophet came down from the Sultana's mast. What happened next in the Ottoman fleet was not a retreat. It was a dissolution. A military force that has lost its commander, its flagship, and its sacred standard in the same moment does not retreat in the organized sense. It fragments. Individual captains made individual decisions to fight on, to surrender, to run. And those decisions produced 3 miles of chaos rather than a coherent withdrawal. In the center, Ottoman galleys whose commanders had not yet seen the Sultana captured began to notice something wrong. The green banner was gone. The Sultana was flying Christian colors. There was a head on a pike where the admiral had been. The news moved through the Ottoman fleet like a fire through dry grass, faster than order could contain, and where it went, fighting stopped and flight began. On the left wing, Barbarigo's Venetians, his own men still fighting through their grief for their commander, still not knowing he was dying below decks, had turned the tide against Mehmed Sirocco. Sirocco himself was killed trying to swim to shore, recognized in the water and pulled out to be identified, then killed on the beach of the Gulf he had known his entire life. The Ottoman right wing collapsed entirely. Its surviving galleys, perhaps 50, drove toward the shore and beached themselves, their crews flooding into the hillsides above Patras, and there was no organized pursuit because the Holy League galleys were too busy dealing with the prisoners and the wreckage and the dead to chase men who had already given up fighting. By early afternoon, it was over. 3 miles of open water that had, 6 hours earlier, been empty and silver and silent, was now so full of debris that men could walk from hull to hull without touching the water. Broken oars floated in clusters. Sails trailed in the water from half-submerged masts. The surface was slick with oil from the weapons and with things darker than oil. Perhaps 120 Ottoman galleys had been sunk or captured. Perhaps 12,000 Christian slaves, unchained from their benches when their galley was taken, moved through the wreckage in a daze, some of them weeping, some of them sitting on the decks of their former prisons and unable to stand, some of them swimming toward the Christian ships with a purposefulness that suggested they were not entirely sure they were free until they climbed aboard and someone told them. Miguel de Cervantes, a Spanish soldier who had fought on one of the galleys of the Venetian division, lay below decks with 3 arquebus wounds. 2 were in his chest. 1 was in his left hand. The wound in his left hand was the worst of the 3. The hand never fully recovered, and for the rest of his life he would refer to himself, without self-pity but with the particular wry pride of a man who has been through something worth surviving, as El Manco de Lepanto, the one-handed man of Lepanto. He was 24 years old. He would spend the next 34 years writing, including a novel about a man who could not stop fighting battles that had already been decided. A man who lived in a world shaped by everything that had happened before him, and could not quite fit himself into the present, because the past was so much more real. The novel was called Don Quixote. It was not about Lepanto. It was about everything. Don John, on the prow of the Real as the afternoon light began to thicken, looked out over what had been done in his name and the names of God and Spain and Venice and the Pope and 300 years of Christian fear. He had spent his life wanting this. He had it.
He held the handrailing of the flagship and stood very still for a long time. Later, witnesses said he had wept. He denied it afterward, as men of his rank were required to do, but several people saw him, and they were not wrong about what they saw. He was 24 years old. He would live only 11 more years, dying in Brussels of typhus in 1578 at the age of 31. The brilliance of Lepanto already fading behind him, already being replaced by the complications and disappointments that awaited every man who had peaked at 24. But on that afternoon,
On the deck of the reel, with the wreckage of the Ottoman fleet surrounding him on all sides, and the sun going slowly down behind the mountains of Greece, he was exactly what he would always be remembered as, the young man who won. The count began as the sun descended. Among the Ottoman losses, the numbers were staggering in ways that took days to fully calculate. Approximately 30,000 Ottoman soldiers and sailors died in the Gulf of Patras on October 7, 1571, a figure that represents, in terms of the professional military capacity of the Ottoman Navy, something close to catastrophic. More than 130 Ottoman galleys were sunk, burned, or captured. The prisoners were numerous enough that the Holy League spent the following days arguing about who held them and who got to ransom them. Among the dead, Mehmed Sirocco, commander of the Ottoman right wing, killed in the water off the northern shore. Ali Pasha, admiral of the Ottoman fleet, whose head remained on the pike through the afternoon until someone thought to take it down, his identity confirmed by the galley slaves who recognized him. The Janissary Corps aboard the Ottoman fleet had been reduced by perhaps half. The corps that had never lost on land or sea had lost, comprehensively, on sea. Among the Holy League dead, the numbers were far lower, approximately 8,000 killed, with twice that number wounded. Agostino Barbarigo, Venetian commander of the left wing, died of his arrow wound on October 8th, one day after the battle. He had been told of the victory before he lost consciousness. Witnesses said he smiled. The 12,000 Christian galley slaves presented a practical problem that was, in its own way, a reflection of the entire battle. They were free, but they had nowhere to go. Many had been taken from ports along the Italian and Spanish and Greek coasts, some of them years ago, some of them far longer. Some had families that might still be alive. Some had returned to find that their families had long since given them up for dead. They were given food and water from Holy League supplies that were not particularly generous to begin with. They were promised their freedom in the formal sense, a freedom that would take months to fully materialize in practical terms. On the afternoon of October 7th, sitting on the captured decks of their former prisons, some of them wept, and some of them prayed, and some of them simply stared at the horizon with the blank stillness of people who have not yet decided how to feel about something enormous. Don John ordered a Thanksgiving Mass celebrated on the deck of the Real as the last light left the water. The priests of the fleet gathered, and the soldiers who could still stand, and the slaves who had been freed, and together they sang something in Latin that the galley slaves from Greece and the soldiers from Spain could not understand, but that everyone understood. On the shore above Patras, the farmers and fishermen who had been watching from the hills since dawn came slowly back down as the light died and stood at the water's edge, looking out at the wreckage of an afternoon that had reshuffled the world, and said nothing, because nothing was adequate. The battlefield, in the days that followed, was not something anyone lingered in by choice. The dead of both fleets floated and were carried by currents along the northern and southern shores. The beached galleys on the north shore rotted through the autumn. Scavengers, local people and foreign ones, picked through the debris for anything useful, for valuables, for weapons, for the 100 small things that dead men leave behind them. The sacred green banner of the Prophet was carried to Rome, where Pope Pius V wept when he received it, and ordered it placed in the Vatican's treasury, where it remained for centuries. Ali Pasha's head was not preserved.
It disappeared in the aftermath, as such things do, carried off by someone whose name was not recorded, toward a destination that history did not follow. The news of Lepanto reached Rome on October 21st, 1571, 2 weeks after the battle. Pope Pius V, who had spent those 2 weeks in prayer and fasting, and the particular anguish of a man who has bet everything on a single outcome he could not control, was meeting with officials of the Dominicans when a messenger arrived. He stopped the meeting. He went to a window. He was silent for a long moment, and then he said, in Latin, words that were recorded by everyone present and have echoed through centuries of Catholic history. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He dismissed the officials. He went to pray. He was weeping before he reached the chapel. In Venice, when the news arrived, the city exploded. Church bells rang for 3 days. The Doge proclaimed a public holiday. Citizens poured into the streets in a spontaneous celebration of a scale that the city would not see again for a generation. The paintings that followed, Titian, Veronese, Tintoretto, the great Venetian painters of the age all eventually turned their hands to Lepanto, were not simply records of a military event. They were attempts to capture the weight of a moment that had seemed, for a brief and terrifying period, as if it might be the last moment of Venetian independence. The Sala dello Scrutinio in the Doge's palace was repainted with scenes of the battle within a decade. The room became, and remains, a monument to the conviction that some things are won, not merely survived. And yet, the Ottoman Empire rebuilt its fleet within a year. By the summer of 1572, Sultan Selim II had authorized the construction of over 200 new galleys, and the Ottoman Navy was back at full fighting strength before the Holy League could coordinate a follow-up campaign. The alliance, which had always been fragile, fractured almost immediately after the victory. Venice, practical as always and running short of money, negotiated a separate peace with the Ottomans in 1573, surrendering Cyprus, the island whose loss had begun the entire chain of events, in exchange for commercial concessions. The Spanish and the Papal States watched this happen and concluded that Venice was Venice and would always be Venice. Don John spent the years after Lepanto campaigning in the Mediterranean and the Netherlands, achieving lesser glories, dying far too young. The Pope, who had wept tears of joy on October 21, 1571, died the following year, in May 1572, having spent his last months puzzling over why the victory he had worked so hard for was not producing the follow-up crusade he had imagined. The Ottoman Empire did not fall. It continued to expand in other directions. It took Tunisia in 1574. It pushed into the western Mediterranean again, more cautiously, more deliberately. It did not, after Lepanto, challenge the combined naval power of a united Christian alliance, because it understood, or its commanders understood, even if they did not say so in the councils of the Sultan, that the combined naval power of a united Christian alliance could beat them. But it also understood, correctly, that the combined naval power of a united Christian alliance was difficult to maintain for longer than a single battle. The Holy League lasted 2 more years, then dissolved. The alliance that had won Lepanto proved exactly as durable as everyone who had negotiated it had feared. What Lepanto ended, definitively and forever, was the idea of Ottoman naval invincibility. For 100 years, since the fall of Constantinople, since the capture of Rhodes, since the raid on Otranto, since the Battle of Preveza in 1538, when a previous Holy League had been comprehensively destroyed, the Ottoman navy had moved through the Mediterranean as if it owned it. There had been Christian victories, small ones, individual engagements where a particular squadron had bested a particular Ottoman force. But the system, the Ottoman naval system, with its vast resources and its professional crews and its culture of relentless expansion, had always recovered and always come back stronger. After Lepanto, the system recovered, but it did not come back the same way. The western Mediterranean, from Italy westward, remained in Christian hands. The Ottoman navy turned its attention northward and eastward, toward the Black Sea, toward toward the eastern Mediterranean, toward the Atlantic, in a more limited and cautious way. The world had been reorganized, subtly but permanently. Miguel de Cervantes, recovering from his wounds in Messina, began writing. He wrote for 34 more years, producing a novel about a man who had read too many stories about knights and glory and had begun to believe that he was living inside one. Don Quixote tilted at windmills he believed were giants, fought battles that were not battles, loved a woman who was not what he believed her to be. He was ridiculous and brave and desperately sincere and entirely wrong about nearly everything he saw. He was, in other words, deeply human in the way that people who have been through something enormous and survived it sometimes become. Enlarged, damaged, funny, sad, unable to stop trying. It is not too much to say that Cervantes could only have written what he wrote after surviving what he survived. The wound in his left hand was not incidental to the novel. It was, in some obscure and important way, the novel. Centuries later, the Gulf of Patras is blue and still on most mornings. The town of Naupactos, the ancient name for the settlement the Venetians called Lepanto, sits on the northern shore, its small harbor enclosed by Venetian walls that were already old in 1571. Tourists walk along those walls and look out at the water and try to imagine what it looked like when the smoke was still rising and the wreckage of 100 galleys was drifting with the current. It is very difficult to imagine. The water is very blue. There are fishing boats and pleasure craft, and in summer, the occasional hydrofoil making its way between Patras and the mainland ports to the west. The mountains are the same. The light is the same. In October, when the air cools and the sea turns from turquoise toward something darker, the mornings come in gray, and there are moments before the sun clears the mountains when the water is silver and flat and still, and you could almost believe that nothing has happened here at all. But something happened here. On a morning very much like that one, 450 years ago, the world decided to be something other than what it had been trending toward, and a 24-year-old man danced on the prow of a ship in the pre-dawn dark, and 12,000 men were unchained from oars, and 2 empires swung at each other across 3 miles of open water, and only one of them came back whole. The sea keeps none of it. The sea is not interested in what happens above its surface. It absorbed the wreckage and the bodies and the blood and the burning wood and gave nothing back. The fishing boats go out every morning. The hydrofoils pass on their schedules. Children swim off the walls of the old harbor in August without knowing what the harbor was built to protect or what it once looked upon. And they are right not to know, because the whole point of what was decided on the morning of October 7th, 1571, is that they should never have to. But we remember, and that is what it means that the battle was fought, and that men danced on their ships in the dark before it, and that they were afraid, and that they went forward anyway. That is what it always means. Here are the key points of the provided content, focusing on the Battle of Lepanto. The Battle of Lepanto, October 7th, 1571. This was a pivotal naval battle fought in the Gulf of Patras between the Ottoman Empire and the Holy League, an alliance of Catholic maritime states, primarily Spain and Venice. Significance of the battle. It halted the Ottoman Empire's expansionist march towards the Atlantic. It shattered the myth of Ottoman naval invincibility at sea. It freed approximately 12,000 Christian galley slaves. It permanently reordered the power dynamics in the Western Mediterranean, keeping it in Christian hands. Prelude to conflict. The Ottoman invasion and brutal conquest of Cyprus, a Venetian possession, leading to the horrific torture and flaying of the Venetian commander Marcantonio Bragadin. News of Bragadin's fate ignited rage in Venice, overcoming their usual commercial pragmatism and driving them to ally with their rivals, Spain. Pope Pius V's fervent efforts to unite Catholic monarchs against the Ottomans, successfully bringing together Spain, Venice, the Papal States, and others. The fleets and commanders. Ottoman fleet, led by Admiral Ali Pasha, a seasoned commander, consisting of 278 galleys and galleots. They were confident in their superiority and their sultan's orders. Holy League fleet, led by the young and improbable Admiral Don John of Austria, 24 years old, comprising 212 galleys and 6 massive galleasses. The alliance was fragile, bound by fear and the memory of Ottoman atrocities. Key innovations and tactics. Galleasses, Venice's innovative hybrid ships, essentially floating fortresses with heavy cannon, positioned in front of the Holy League line. They inflicted significant damage and caused disarray among the advancing Ottoman galleys before the main engagement. Ottoman crescent formation, a traditional and successful tactic, but limited in the Gulf of Patras due to geography, preventing full envelopment. Holy League, line formation, a deliberate strategy to counter the Ottoman crescent and utilize the galleasses. The battle itself. Initial engagement. The galleasses opened fire, a terrifying and unprecedented display of firepower that broke the initial Ottoman advance. Main battle. A chaotic, close-quarters struggle across a 3-mile front. Left wing. The Venetians, despite the death of their commander Barbarigo, held their ground against Mehmed Sirocco. Right wing. Ulugh Ali, a skilled Ottoman commander, exploited a gap created by the careful Doria, but was eventually repulsed by reserves and was the only Ottoman commander to escape with ships. Center. The climax occurred with the clash of the flagships, the Real and the Sultana. After intense fighting, Don John's forces boarded and captured the Sultana. Turning point and aftermath. Death of Ali Pasha. The Ottoman admiral was killed, his head displayed on a pike, leading to the dissolution and rout of the Ottoman fleet. Ottoman losses. Devastating, with around 30,000 dead, over 130 ships sunk or captured, and the professional military capacity of their navy severely crippled. Holy League losses. Significantly lower, around 8,000 dead. Miguel de Cervantes, a Spanish soldier who fought at Lepanto, sustaining a wound in his left hand that would permanently mark him as El Manco de Lepanto, and later influence his writing, most famously Don Quixote.